Welcome, dear viewer, to a tale that transcends time itself. In an era when steel rails carved destiny across a young nation and marble mansions rose like dreams against Fifth Avenue's skyline, love dared to bloom between worlds apart. This is the story of Margaret Rose O'Sullivan, an Irish seamstress whose heart carried more nobility than any bloodline, and William Harrison Whitmore III, a railroad baron who discovered that true wealth lies not in empire, but in the courage to love beyond society's cruel boundaries. Where do you call home, dear friend? Whether you watch from bustling cities or quiet countryside, love's universal language speaks the same truth across all borders and through every generation. If this story touches your soul, please subscribe and leave a like. Your support allows us to continue sharing these timeless tales of the human heart. Year, 1875. Place, New York City, during the height of America's Gilded Age. The gaslight flickered against mahogany walls as William Harrison Whitmore III stood motionless in the doorway of his Fifth Avenue mansion's parlor, his breath caught between disbelief and the sharp sting of betrayal. Through the crack in the heavy oak door, Victoria Pemberton's laughter tinkled like champagne crystal against his business partner's deeper chuckle. "The fool believes himself in love," Victoria's voice carried the cruel precision of a blade through silk. "Once we marry, Charles, the railroad shares will be ours within the year. A grieving widower with 2 small children. How perfectly convenient." Charles Astor Vanderbilt's response was a low rumble of satisfaction. "And when the documents are signed, then William Harrison Whitmore III will learn what it means to trust a woman who sees dollar signs where he sees devotion." William's fingers tightened against the doorframe, his knuckles whitening like winter bone. The scent of Victoria's French perfume, once intoxicating, now turned acrid in his nostrils. 3 years of carefully constructed affection crumbled like autumn leaves beneath the weight of truth. He had been so careful after Eleanor's death, so cautious with his heart and his children's future. Yet here he stood, a man who commanded steel empires across a continent, reduced to eavesdropping on the destruction of his trust. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, each note resonating through his chest like a funeral bell. His children slept peacefully upstairs, unaware that their father's world was reshaping itself in the span of stolen words. William stepped back from the door, his decision crystallizing with the precision that had built his railroad fortune. Tomorrow, Victoria Pemberton and Charles Astor Vanderbilt would discover that some fortunes are not so easily stolen. But tonight, as rain began to whisper against the tall windows, William Harrison Whitmore III wondered if he would ever trust his heart again. The needle slipped, and Margaret Rose O'Sullivan watched a perfect bead of crimson bloom across the ivory silk. In the dim gaslight of the 5 Points tenement, her fingers had finally betrayed her. These hands that had sewn dreams into fabric for ladies who would never know her name. "Margaret, child," Mrs. Catherine Murphy's voice drifted from the narrow bed, weak as morning mist. The older woman's breathing had grown more labored with each passing day, each breath a small battle won against the illness that crept through her lungs like winter fog. "Rest now, Mrs. Murphy." Margaret set aside the ruined silk, her wages for the week dissolved in a single drop of blood. "The doctor says the mountain air could help. Clean air, proper care. $500 might as well be 5,000 to folks like us." Mrs. Murphy's Irish accent, usually strong as tea, had faded to barely a whisper. Margaret rose and moved to the small window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Below, the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan teemed with life, pushcart vendors calling their wares, children dodging between carriages, immigrants carrying their hopes in cloth bundles. This was her world, a place where survival was measured in daily bread and weekly rent. But somewhere beyond these crowded streets, in mansions of marble and rooms hung with silk, there were those for whom $500 was merely the cost of an evening's entertainment. The woman who would collect the ruined dress tomorrow, Mrs. Hamilton of Washington Square, wore pearls worth more than Margaret's lifetime earnings. Yet Margaret had been raised to believe that dignity was not for sale, that respectability was more precious than gold. Mrs. Murphy had saved her from the cholera epidemic that took her parents when Margaret was barely 4 years old. This woman, no blood relation but more mother than memory could hold, had fed her, clothed her, taught her to read from the Bible, and to sew with fingers that could coax beauty from the plainest cloth. Now those fingers trembled as Margaret took Mrs. Murphy's hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and the bones beneath, as delicate as bird wings. "There must be another way," Margaret whispered to the night-darkened window. But in the distance she could hear the whistle of a train, carrying someone else's dreams towards someone else's destiny. Madame Dubois held court in a parlor that breathed prosperity from every carefully chosen detail. Persian rugs whispered beneath silk slippers, crystal decanters caught gaslight like captured rainbows, and the air itself seemed perfumed with possibilities that had nothing to do with virtue. Margaret Rose sat primly on the edge of a velvet chair, her worn wool dress a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. She had come here on whispered recommendation from another seamstress, a girl who spoke of genteel employment for ladies of refinement. "You have been educated, ma chère." Madame Dubois circled Margaret with the practiced eye of a connoisseur, her French accent lending sophistication to what Margaret was beginning to suspect was not quite the employment she had imagined. "The Sisters of Charity taught me until I was 15. French, literature, music." Margaret's voice trailed off, as understanding dawned like unwelcome sunrise. Madame Dubois smiled, and it was not unkind. "Ah, but see how you carry yourself? Even in distress, there is something untouchable about you. This is rare, précieuse. My gentlemen are not common sailors seeking rough companionship. They are titans of industry, lonely men of refinement who desire conversation, music, perhaps I should leave." Margaret rose, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and something else, a terrible calculation of exactly how much her virtue might be worth. $50 for an evening of companionship. The words hung in the perfumed air like a challenge, for conversation with a gentleman who appreciates education and refinement. Nothing more is required unless you choose it. Margaret's hand froze on the door handle. $50. 10 weeks of seamstress wages. 10 weeks closer to Mrs. Murphy's salvation. The gentlemen who visit here are not monsters, child. They are men who have everything except someone to truly see them. Madame Dubois moved to her escritoire, withdrawing a calling card made of heavy cream paper. "Baron Whitmore requests an engagement tomorrow evening. A recent widower, refined, known for his generosity to those who show him genuine kindness." Margaret stared at the card, at the elegant script that spelled out a name she had seen in newspaper headlines. William Harrison Whitmore III, the railroad baron whose empire stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. $100, Madame Dubois said softly, "for one evening with a gentleman who has forgotten what it means to be seen as a man rather than a fortune." The card trembled in Margaret's fingers like a butterfly wing. Outside, church bells chimed the hour, and somewhere Mrs. Murphy waited for a miracle that would never come through needlework alone. Margaret Rose O'Sullivan closed her eyes and stepped across a threshold that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. The Plaza Hotel's private dining room glowed like a jewel box in the gaslight, all burgundy velvet and gleaming mahogany, but William Harrison Whitmore III saw only the young woman who sat across from him with the precise posture of someone who had been taught that dignity was armor against a harsh world. Margaret Rose O'Sullivan was not what he had expected. Madame Dubois had promised refinement, but this went deeper than mere education. In the candlelight, her auburn hair caught fire, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of sorrow understood and transformed into quiet strength. "You are surprised," she said softly, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I can see it in your expression." William set down his wineglass, studying her face. "I confess, Miss O'Sullivan, I expected someone more worldly. You have the bearing of a convent-educated lady." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. The Sisters of Charity would be horrified to hear their teachings praised in such circumstances. "And yet here you are." "And yet here I am." She met his gaze directly, unflinching. "Necessity, Mr. Whitmore, is a harsh teacher of lessons we never thought we would learn." Something in her voice, not shame but acknowledgement, made William lean forward. This was not a woman who had fallen into this life through weakness or poor character. This was someone who had made an impossible choice with clear eyes and steady hands. "May I ask what necessity brought you here?" Margaret hesitated, then spoke of Mrs. Murphy with the gentle reverence reserved for saints. She painted a picture of childhood saved by kindness, of love that transcended blood, of a woman dying slowly while the cure existed, just beyond reach of an honest girl's earnings. William found himself moved by more than her beauty or her grace. Here was someone who understood loyalty, who would sacrifice anything for those she loved. In a world where Victoria Pemberton had taught him that affection could be purchased and trust was merely another commodity, Margaret Rose O'Sullivan spoke of love as if it were sacred. $500, he said quietly. Margaret's eyes widened. "Sir, for Mrs. Murphy's treatment, consider it an investment in character, something far too rare in my usual circles." I cannot accept charity, Mr. Whitmore. Then earn it. He leaned back, studying her face in the candlelight. Stay with me tonight, not as Madame Dubois' arrangement, but as Margaret Rose O'Sullivan. Let me know who you are when you're not being what necessity demands. The silence stretched between them like a bridge over unknown waters. Finally, Margaret nodded, and William saw something in her eyes that he had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of truth between two souls who had both learned that trust was a luxury they could not afford. Yet somehow, in this room perfumed with roses and secrets, they began to trust anyway. Spring painted the Hudson Valley in watercolors of hope as Margaret Rose O'Sullivan stood before the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate. The carriage wheels had carved their journey through landscapes that grew more beautiful with each mile from the city, and now she faced a decision that would define not just her future, but the shape of her soul. William had made his proposal with the careful precision of a man accustomed to negotiating empires. She would serve as governess to Elizabeth and James, his children who had grown wild as garden roses without a mother's tender pruning. $200 monthly, a cottage of her own, clothing appropriate to her position, and the understanding that she would also serve as his companion when propriety allowed. The arrangement was scandalous by society's measure, yet somehow more honest than the marriages of convenience that filled the social pages. At least here, all parties understood the terms. Elizabeth Whitmore, 7 years of summer sunshine and stubborn chin, watched from an upstairs window as Margaret's trunks were unloaded. The child had her father's intelligent eyes and her late mother's delicate features, but there was something guarded in her expression that spoke of too many governesses who had come and gone like seasonal flowers. James, barely 5, pressed his nose against the glass beside his sister, his dark hair unruly despite someone's recent attempt at taming it with pomade. He had the look of a boy who measured adults by their capacity for adventure rather than their adherence to rules. Margaret's cottage sat apart from the main house, connected by a garden path lined with climbing roses that would bloom white as prayer flags when summer arrived. The rooms were small but perfectly appointed, with windows that caught morning light and evening stars in equal measure. Here she could maintain the fiction of respectability while navigating the delicate truth of her arrangement with their father. Mrs. Henley, the housekeeper, showed Margaret through the main house with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen many young women arrive with hopes and leave with disappointment. But there was kindness in her manner as she explained the children's routines, their preferences, their particular sorrows. "They haven't had a mother's touch in 3 years, Mrs. Henley said as they paused outside the schoolroom. His lordship does his best, but a man can't teach a little girl how to braid her hair or comfort a boy's nightmares the way a woman can." That evening, Margaret dined with the family in the small parlor rather than the formal dining room. William watched his children's faces as they studied their new governess, seeing Elizabeth's cautious hope and James's immediate fascination with someone who spoke to them as if their thoughts mattered. "Miss O'Sullivan," Elizabeth said carefully, "our last governess said we were incorrigible. Do you know what that means?" Margaret smiled, and something in the room shifted like sunlight breaking through clouds. "It means you have strong spirits that haven't yet learned how to dance together instead of fighting. Shall we see if we can teach them to waltz?" James giggled, and Elizabeth's stern expression cracked like ice in spring. Later, as Margaret walked the garden path to her cottage, she felt William's eyes following her from his study window. The arrangement was complex, fraught with dangers to reputation and heart alike. But as night settled over the estate like a benediction, Margaret allowed herself to hope that here, finally, she might find something that felt like home. Summer unfolded across the Whitmore estate, like a benediction written in roses and ripening fruit. Margaret Rose had woven herself into the fabric of daily life with the skill of someone who understood that love was built not in grand gestures, but in the patient accumulation of small kindnesses. Elizabeth had stopped testing her governess with deliberate misbehavior when she realized that Margaret's discipline came wrapped in understanding rather than condemnation. The girl's wild hair now fell in neat braids adorned with flowers from the garden, and her lessons had become adventures in discovery rather than tedious recitations. James had claimed Margaret as his particular favorite, following her through the house like a devoted puppy. She had taught him to read using adventure stories rather than moral primers, and his eager questions about pirates and explorers revealed a mind hungry for wonder. But it was in the quiet moments that the true transformation occurred. Margaret mending torn books, while Elizabeth practiced piano. Margaret listening gravely to James's elaborate tales of imaginary dragons. Margaret standing at the parlor window as evening painted the Hudson River gold, watching for the lights of William's returning carriage. He had begun arriving home earlier, drawn by something indefinable that had settled over his house, like peace made tangible. Margaret presided over dinner conversations with the grace of someone born to the role, coaxing stories from the children, offering gentle counsel, creating the warm domestic rhythm that had been missing since Eleanor's death. The estate staff had initially watched Margaret with the wary interest reserved for temporary fixtures, but her genuine kindness toward everyone from the head gardener to the scullery maid had won their respect. She remembered their names, inquired after their families, and treated each person with the dignity she herself sought. Mrs. Murphy's letters arrived weekly from the Adirondack Sanitarium, each one reporting improvement that seemed miraculous after months of decline. The mountain air, the skilled physicians, the proper nutrition, all purchased with money that came from Margaret's careful navigation of an impossible situation. William found himself watching Margaret with growing wonder. She moved through his world with the natural grace of someone who belonged, yet never forgot her origins or treated her position as more than it was. She was neither servile nor presumptuous, neither ashamed of her circumstances nor bitter about the necessity that had brought her here. One evening, as Margaret helped Elizabeth with her watercolors in the garden, William approached carrying letters from his business offices. But instead of retreating to his study as usual, he settled on the garden bench beside Margaret, drawn by the peaceful domestic scene. "Papa," Elizabeth announced, "Miss O'Sullivan says I have an artist's eye, but I must learn patience. She says beautiful things take time to grow properly." William glanced at Margaret, who was carefully not meeting his gaze while she guided James through his letters. "Miss O'Sullivan is very wise. Will you stay for James's reading lesson?" Margaret asked quietly. "He's been hoping to show you his progress." Something in her voice, hope wrapped carefully in propriety, made William nod. And as the summer evening settled around them like a blessing, the railroad baron who commanded steel empires across a continent discovered that some territories were conquered not by force, but by the patient accumulation of trust, respect, and something that felt remarkably like love. September arrived like a gentle revelation, painting the Hudson Valley in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to reflect the warmth settling in unexpected corners of the Whitmore house. Elizabeth's 8th birthday dawned clear and bright, with morning mist rising from the river like incense, offered to autumn's first breath. Margaret had spent weeks planning the celebration with the meticulous care of someone who understood that childhood memories were treasures more precious than any material gift. The dining room had been transformed into a fairy garden, with white silk ribbons wound through climbing ivy, and crystal bowls filled with floating rose petals that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Elizabeth, radiant in a dress of pale blue silk that Margaret had sewn by candlelight, moved through her party with the grave dignity of a princess receiving homage. But it was the way she sought Margaret's approving glances, the trust in her small hand as she cut her cake, that spoke volumes about the bonds that had grown between them. William watched from the doorway as Margaret orchestrated the party with seamless grace, ensuring that each staff member's child felt included, that every detail served Elizabeth's happiness rather than adult pretension. This was not the forced gaiety of society entertaining, but the genuine celebration of a child beloved. As evening settled over the estate and the last guests departed, William found Margaret in the garden, gathering the scattered rose petals from the party decorations. The September air carried the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples, and her auburn hair caught moonlight like captured flame. "Elizabeth will remember this day for the rest of her life," he said softly, settling beside her on the stone bench where they had shared so many quiet conversations. "Good memories are the foundation of strong character," Margaret replied, her hands still busy with the delicate work of preservation. "A child who knows she is cherished will carry that knowledge like armor against whatever trials await her." William studied her profile in the moonlight, seeing the shadows that spoke of her own childhood trials, the strength that had been forged in adversity. "And what of you, Margaret Rose? What memories armor your heart?" She paused in her gathering, her hands stilling among the scattered petals. "Mrs. Murphy teaching me to read by lamplight, the sisters showing me that dignity is not dependent upon circumstances. You—" She stopped, as if the words had escaped before propriety could contain them. "Me?" Margaret turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw not the careful respect of an employee, nor the calculated affection of someone protecting her position, but something that made his heart race with possibility. You treating me as if I were worthy of respect, when you had every reason to see me as merely a convenience. You trusting me with your children's hearts. You showing me that kindness and strength need not be separate virtues. The distance between them on the bench seemed both infinite and non-existent. William reached for her hand, finding it warm and real and trembling slightly in his grasp. "Margaret Rose O'Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of confession, "I find myself in love with a woman whose worth I could never have calculated in any currency I previously understood." Her breath caught, and for a moment the garden held its breath with her. Then she smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "William Harrison Whitmore III," she whispered, "I find myself loving a man who taught me that my heart was not for sale, even when I thought everything else was." The kiss that followed was gentle as prayer, profound as promise, sealing an understanding that transcended all the practical arrangements that had brought them together. In the garden where Elizabeth's birthday roses still perfumed the air, two souls acknowledged what their hearts had been whispering for months. When they finally drew apart, William's eyes held a question that required no words. Margaret nodded, her answer carrying the weight of complete trust, and together they rose to walk the garden path toward a future neither had dared to imagine. Winter settled over the Hudson Valley like a beautiful curse, blanketing the Whitmore estate in pristine snow that sparkled with deceptive innocence under the January sun. But in the grand ballrooms and drawing rooms of New York society, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to destroy everything Margaret and William had so carefully built. The announcement of their engagement had appeared in the social pages like a declaration of war. Mrs. Hamilton's Thursday salon buzzed with scandal. The Union Club's leather chairs creaked under the weight of outraged railroad magnates. Ladies who had never spoken Margaret's name suddenly became experts on her unsuitability, and men who had conducted their own questionable arrangements adopted poses of moral superiority. "An Irish seamstress," Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt pronounced with the finality of divine judgment, from the 5 Points tenements. "William has clearly taken leave of his senses." Charles Astor Vanderbilt, still smarting from his banishment from the Whitmore circle, fanned the flames with carefully chosen words. "One wonders what hold such a woman might have over a man of Whitmore's standing. Surely this is temporary madness brought on by prolonged grief." The attacks grew more vicious as winter deepened. Invitations to social events stopped arriving at the Whitmore estate. Business associates began finding excuses to postpone meetings. The New York Herald published a thinly veiled editorial about the dangers of elevating the unworthy. And suddenly, Margaret found herself the subject of speculation and scorn from strangers who had never met her but felt qualified to judge her heart. Margaret bore the assault with the dignity that had been her armor since childhood, but William watched the toll it took. She grew quieter during their evening walks, more careful in her interactions with the staff, as if trying to make herself smaller to avoid providing ammunition to her critics. Elizabeth and James, blissfully unaware of society's verdict, continued to bloom under Margaret's care, but even they began to sense the tension that crept into the house like winter draft, the way conversations stopped when they entered rooms, the worried glances exchanged between adults. It was Mrs. Henley who brought the worst news, her usually composed face tight with anger as she placed the morning newspapers on William's desk. "Sir, you should see what they're saying now." The article was unsigned but venomous, painting Margaret as a calculating opportunist who had seduced a grief-stricken widower for his fortune. It detailed her brief connection with Madame Dubois with the salacious glee of gossips who had never faced desperate circumstances themselves. William's hands shook with rage as he read, seeing his beloved reduced to crude caricature by people who knew nothing of her courage, her sacrifice, her boundless capacity for love. That evening, he found Margaret in the children's schoolroom, helping James with his letters while Elizabeth practiced piano. The domestic scene should have been peaceful, but he could see the careful way Margaret held herself, as if expecting another blow to fall. "Margaret," he said quietly, waiting until the children were absorbed in their tasks, "we could travel to Europe. Let this pass. When we return, they will have found other scandals to occupy their attention." She looked up from James's copybook, her green eyes clear but tired. "Running away will only confirm their accusations. Besides, this is not about me, William. This is about whether you are strong enough to stand against their judgment for the sake of love. And if I am? If we weather this storm together? Margaret smiled, and it was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Then we will have earned something worth more than their approval. We will have proven that love is stronger than prejudice, that character matters more than circumstance. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the estate in pristine silence. But inside the schoolroom, as Elizabeth's piano music filled the air and James carefully formed his letters, Margaret Rose O'Sullivan and William Harrison Whitmore III prepared to fight for a love that society deemed impossible. The battle for their hearts was only beginning. The Astor Mansion in Newport blazed with 1,000 candles on New Year's Eve, 1876, as if trying to hold back the darkness that seemed to gather in the corners of grand ballrooms where secrets bred like shadows. Margaret Rose stood at the edge of the conservatory, her emerald silk gown, a gift from William, making her feel both beautiful and exposed among the glittering assemblage of New York's elite. She had not wanted to attend, but William had insisted with gentle firmness. "We cannot let them drive us into hiding, my dear. Our love deserves to stand in the light." Yet surrounded by hostile whispers and cutting glances, Margaret wondered if some battles were worth fighting. The women who had once nodded politely now turned their backs with choreographed precision. The men who had bid respectfully on her embroidery at charity auctions now looked through her as if she were invisible. Victoria Pemberton materialized from the crowd like a serpent, emerging from Eden's flowers. Her burgundy dress cut to display advantages that had once captivated William's attention. She was more beautiful than ever, Margaret noted with a stab of unwelcome insecurity, polished and perfect as a porcelain doll, with not a single thread out of place. "Miss O'Sullivan," Victoria's voice carried the honeyed poison of refined cruelty. "How surprising to see you here, though I suppose William feels obligated to display his charity work." Margaret straightened, calling upon every lesson in dignity the Sisters of Charity had ever taught her. "Mrs. Pemberton, I hope you are enjoying the evening." "Oh, my dear girl." Victoria moved closer, her perfume cloying as funeral flowers. "You cannot imagine how I have agonized over whether to speak, but surely someone must tell you the truth." A cold dread began to spread through Margaret's chest like winter frost. "I'm not sure what you mean." Victoria's smile was all sympathy and venom. "William and we have reconciled, you see. This engagement to you, it's merely his way of quieting the gossips about our relationship. A temporary fiction to protect propriety while we resolve certain complications." "Complications?" "I'm expecting his child." Victoria's hand rested protectively over her still flat stomach. "A son, the doctors believe. An heir for the Whitmore name. Surely you understand that changes everything." Margaret's world tilted like a ship in a storm. The conservatory's tropical warmth felt suddenly stifling, the scent of orchids too sweet, too cloying. "I don't believe you." "Oh, my poor dear." Victoria withdrew a letter from her evening bag, the paper bearing William's personal seal. "He asked me to show you this, if necessary. He hasn't had the courage to tell you himself. Men are such cowards about these things, aren't they?" Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the letter, recognizing William's handwriting, but not the cruel words it contained. Words about obligation and arrangement, about the temporary nature of their understanding, about the necessity of securing his legacy through proper bloodlines. The letter fell from her nerveless fingers like a dying bird. "He does care for you in his way," Victoria continued with false kindness. "You've been wonderful with the children, and he's grateful. But surely you can see that a man of his position cannot seriously consider marrying someone of your background." Margaret heard her own voice as if from a great distance. "The children will be provided for naturally. William is not cruel, but they will need a proper mother now, someone who can guide them in society, someone who belongs in their world." The conservatory spun around Margaret like a carousel of exotic flowers and shattered dreams. Everything she had believed, every moment of tenderness they had shared, every whispered promise, all of it crumbled like sandcastles before an incoming tide. "Excuse me," she whispered, pushing past Victoria toward the mansion's great doors. Behind her, Victoria Pemberton smiled in triumph, unaware that the letter she had shown was a masterpiece of forgery, crafted by a woman whose hatred ran deeper than any love she had ever known. In the carriage ride back to the Hudson Valley, Margaret stared out at the winter landscape and tried to understand how she had been so foolish as to believe that love could truly conquer the vast distances between their worlds. The fairy tale, it seemed, was ending exactly as fairy tales did for girls who forgot their place. Dawn broke grey and pitiless over the Hudson Valley as Margaret Rose O'Sullivan, folded her few possessions into the same worn trunk that had carried her dreams to the Whitmore estate. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, each item a small goodbye to the life she had allowed herself to believe was real. The letter she left for William lay sealed on her escritoire, its contents as carefully measured as a surgeon's incision. She wrote of her unworthiness, of her realization that their worlds could never truly merge, of her discovery of a religious calling that demanded her immediate attention. She mentioned nothing of Victoria's revelation. Such knowledge would only cause him pain when he had already chosen his path. Elizabeth found her first, drawn by some instinct that sensed upheaval in the carefully ordered world Margaret had created for them. The child stood in the doorway in her white nightgown, her dark hair tumbled with sleep, her eyes already filling with the tears of abandonment she had learned too well. "You're leaving us," Elizabeth whispered, the words carrying the weight of accusation and heartbreak. Margaret knelt to the child's level, her own tears threatening to overwhelm the careful composure she had maintained through the night. "Sometimes grown-ups must make choices that seem wrong but are necessary. You will understand someday." "I will never understand." Elizabeth's voice carried the fierce certainty of childhood betrayal. "You promised you would always be here. You promised we would be a family." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, each one true and terrible. She had made those promises in the garden's moonlight, believing them with her whole heart. She had woven herself into these children's lives so completely that her departure would leave wounds that might never fully heal. James appeared behind his sister, rubbing sleep from his eyes, but sensing the grief that filled the room like smoke. "Miss Margaret, why are you sad?" She gathered them both into her arms, memorizing the weight of them, the scent of childhood innocence and trust betrayed. "I must go away for a while. But remember that I love you both, and that will never change no matter where I am or how long we are apart." The carriage arrived as the household was waking, and Margaret slipped away like a thief, stealing nothing more valuable than her own heart. She left behind the silk dresses William had given her, the books they had read together, the small tokens of a life she had been foolish enough to believe was hers to keep. The convent of the Sacred Heart in Albany received her with the gentle understanding reserved for souls in crisis. Mother Superior Catherine took one look at Margaret's carefully composed face and saw the devastation beneath. "Child," she said in the same Irish accent that had colored Margaret's earliest memories, "what has brought you to seek sanctuary here?" "I have lost my way," Margaret replied, the simple truth encompassing everything she could not say. "I need to remember who I am meant to be." The convent's routines wrapped around her like bandages on a wound, morning prayers before dawn, silent meditation in the chapel, hours spent in service to others whose needs exceeded her own. The sisters asked no questions about her past, accepting her desire for retreat and reflection as natural to a soul seeking God's guidance. But in the quiet hours before sleep, when the chapel bells had fallen silent and the convent settled into holy stillness, Margaret's hand would rest on her stomach, where William's child was beginning to grow. She had suspected for weeks, but confirmed her condition with the convent's physician, a kindly man who asked no questions about unwed mothers seeking shelter. The child would be born in autumn, she calculated, a living reminder of love that had seemed real enough to build a life upon. She would raise this baby alone, creating a new identity as a respectable widow, protecting William's reputation and ensuring his legitimate heir would inherit without complication. It was the last gift she could give him, her silence, her absence, and the preservation of his place in a world that had never intended to include her. Outside her narrow window, spring began its slow return to the Albany countryside, but Margaret Rose O'Sullivan felt as if winter had taken permanent residence in her heart. Spring arrived at the convent of the Sacred Heart, like a gentle benediction, painting the chapel garden in watercolors of promise that seemed to mock the careful emptiness Margaret had constructed around her heart. The morning sickness had passed, leaving behind the strange vitality that seemed to transform her body into something mysteriously purposeful. Sister Bernadette, the convent's midwife, examined Margaret with the practiced discretion of someone who had delivered many babies to women whose stories remained unspoken. Her hands were gentle as she confirmed what Margaret's body had been whispering for weeks. "Twins," Sister Bernadette announced with quiet joy. "Due in early autumn, I would say. September, perhaps October." Margaret's hand flew to her still flat stomach, wonder and terror warring in her chest. One child would have been complicated enough to hide, to explain, to raise alone. 2 children would require a complete reinvention of her story, her life, her future. "You seem distressed, child," Sister Bernadette observed. Most mothers find joy in such news. "I am unmarried," Margaret whispered, the admission carrying the weight of confession. Sister Bernadette's expression remained serene. "And yet, you carry life, which is God's greatest gift, regardless of the circumstances of its conception. These children will need a mother who sees them as blessings, rather than burdens." Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself settling into the convent's rhythms with unexpected peace. She helped in the kitchen gardens, where the sight of seeds transforming into sustenance seemed to mirror her body's mysterious work. She taught letters to the local children who came for lessons, finding comfort in young minds eager for knowledge rather than judgment. But it was in the evening hours, when the chapel bells marked the end of another day, that Margaret allowed herself to imagine the faces of the children growing beneath her heart. Would they have William's intelligent eyes, her stubborn chin? Would they carry themselves with the natural dignity she had seen in Elizabeth and James? Mother Superior Catherine had accepted Margaret's story of recent widowhood without question. Understanding that some truths were too painful for immediate telling, she assigned Margaret to transcribe religious texts, work that could be done in quiet privacy as her condition progressed. "For you have beautiful handwriting," Mother Superior observed one afternoon, reviewing Margaret's careful copying of theological manuscripts. "Clear and elegant. Have you considered that God might have brought you here not just for sanctuary, but for purpose?" Margaret paused in her writing, considering the possibility that her exile might serve some greater design. "I confess I have felt more lost than purposeful, Mother. Perhaps that is because you are looking backward rather than forward. These children you carry, they are not punishments for past choices, but possibilities for future grace." That night, Margaret knelt in the chapel's candlelit silence and allowed herself to pray not for forgiveness, but for wisdom. Somewhere in the Hudson Valley, William was living the life she had preserved for him, free from scandal and inappropriate attachments. Elizabeth and James were growing under the care of someone more suitable to their station. She had made the necessary sacrifices to protect everyone she loved. Now she must learn to build something meaningful from what remained. As summer deepened and her body began to show the unmistakable signs of pregnancy, Margaret started planning for a future she had never imagined. She would leave the convent before her condition became obvious, find a small town where a young widow might live quietly with her children, support herself through teaching or needlework. She would give these babies everything she could: love, education, dignity, and the knowledge that they were wanted even if they were not expected. But she would never tell them that their father was a railroad baron who had once promised their mother the world, only to have it slip away like water through desperate fingers. Some truths, she had learned, were too dangerous for anyone's peace. The village of Woodstock, Vermont, embraced Margaret Rose like arms opening to welcome a prodigal daughter home. Nestled in mountains that seemed to hold secrets as old as stones, the small community offered something more precious than anonymity. It offered the possibility of belonging without explanation. Margaret had arrived in late spring, her pregnancy barely showing beneath carefully chosen clothing, carrying papers that identified her as Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, recent widow of a merchant lost at sea. The story was simple enough to remember, tragic enough to discourage too many questions, and respectable enough to secure her the small cottage on the edge of town that would become her sanctuary. Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the village's unofficial guardian of morals and dispenser of practical wisdom, had taken one look at Margaret's careful deportment and educated speech and declared her a lady fallen on hard times, but not in character. The endorsement opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a stranger, carrying obvious evidence of unmarried intimacy. The cottage was small but perfect, 2 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor and kitchen below, with windows that caught morning light, and a garden where Margaret could grow vegetables and flowers in equal measure. She furnished it with careful economy, choosing pieces that were serviceable rather than beautiful, creating a home that spoke of genteel poverty rather than shameful exile. Thomas and Charlotte were born on a September evening when autumn painted the mountains in shades of fire and gold. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the village physician, delivered them with the calm efficiency of someone who had brought countless lives into the world and asked no uncomfortable questions about their origins. Thomas emerged first, his cries announcing his arrival with the imperious demand of someone born to command. He had his father's dark hair and the promise of his strong features, but his eyes were Margaret's green, bright with intelligence and determination. Charlotte followed minutes later, as if reluctant to leave the warm darkness, where she had shared everything with her brother. She was smaller, more delicate, with auburn hair that caught light like captured flame, and an expression that seemed to take in the world with quiet wonder. "Beautiful children, Dr. Morrison pronounced as he cleaned and examined them. "Strong and healthy. You are blessed, Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret held her babies with wonder that bordered on disbelief. These perfect beings had grown from love, even if that love had proven as fragile as morning mist. They were entirely hers now, their futures unencumbered by the complicated past that had shaped their conception. The village accepted the twins with the easy grace of people accustomed to life's unexpected gifts. Mrs. Hartwell proclaimed them the most beautiful babies ever born in Woodstock, and proceeded to organize a steady stream of visitors bearing gifts of baby clothes, blankets, and casseroles. Margaret supported herself by taking in fine embroidery and offering piano lessons to the daughters of families prosperous enough to value such accomplishments. Her work was exquisite. Her needle could coax miracles from silk and thread, and her teaching patient and encouraging. Soon she had established herself as an essential part of the community's cultural life. Thomas grew into a serious little boy who approached everything with methodical determination. He had inherited his father's gift for seeing systems and structures, building elaborate block towers and organizing his toys with impressive precision. But he also had his mother's gentle heart, offering comfort to injured animals and sharing his treats with children who had none. Charlotte was her mother's daughter in temperament, quiet, observant, with an artist's eye for beauty and a poet's sensitivity to the emotions that flowed beneath surface conversations. She could sit for hours arranging flowers or listening to stories, her attention complete and focused as sunlight through a magnifying glass. By the time the twins reached their 4th birthday, Margaret had created a life that felt both secure and purposeful. They attended the village school, where their quick minds and gentle manners made them favorites among teachers and classmates alike. Margaret served on the church committee and contributed to local charities, establishing herself as a woman of character despite her mysterious past. But sometimes, in the quiet evening hours when the children were asleep and the mountain silence pressed close around the cottage, Margaret would find herself wondering about the life she had left behind. Did William ever think of her? Had Elizabeth learned to braid her own hair? Was James still fascinated by stories of adventure and exploration? These thoughts came less frequently as time passed, like scars that ached only when the weather changed. Margaret had learned to live in the present tense, to find fulfillment in the daily miracles of watching her children grow into themselves. She never expected the past to find her. She certainly never expected it to step off the afternoon train on a May day when the lilacs were blooming, and the future seemed as settled as the mountains themselves. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with Margaret Rose O'Sullivan's story. The Woodstock train station buzzed with the lazy energy of a May afternoon, all dappled sunlight and the promise of summer sliding down from the green mountains like honey. Margaret Rose walked hand in hand with Thomas and Charlotte, their small faces bright with excitement, at the prospect of meeting the train that brought newspapers and packages from the larger world beyond their valley. It had become their weekly ritual, this walk to the station where the children could watch the great iron horse arrive, with its cargo of mystery and possibility. At nearly 4 years old, the twins were endlessly fascinated by anything mechanical, though Charlotte preferred to study the passengers, while Thomas examined the locomotive's workings with the intense focus he brought to everything. Margaret carried their small picnic in a wicker basket, planning to spread a blanket in the station park afterward, where the children could play while she mended Mrs. Hartwell's best tablecloth. It was an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary week of an ordinary life that had become extraordinary in its simple contentment. The train arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, its whistle echoing off the mountain walls like a brass announcement of importance. Steam hissed and wheels shrieked against rails as the locomotive settled into stillness, and passengers began to emerge from the cars like actors taking the stage for a performance Margaret never expected to witness. She saw him before he saw her, that familiar silhouette stepping down from the first-class car with the same unconscious authority that had once commanded railroad empires. William Harrison Whitmore III had aged in the 4 years since their parting, silver threading through his dark hair and new lines mapping the territory around his eyes, but he carried himself with the same quiet strength that had first captured her attention in a hotel dining room that seemed like another lifetime. Margaret's breath stopped in her chest as if someone had stolen all the air from the mountain valley. Her hand tightened reflexively on Charlotte's fingers, while Thomas tugged impatiently at her other arm. eager to move closer to the fascinating machinery of arrival and departure. "Mama," Charlotte whispered with the intuitive perception that had always made her seem older than her years. "Why are you frightened?" Before Margaret could form an answer, William's gaze found hers across the small crowd of villagers and travelers. His face went through a series of transformations: surprise, recognition, wonder, and something deeper that made Margaret's carefully constructed composure threaten to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. But it was when his eyes moved to the children at her side that the world truly shifted on its axis. Thomas had inherited more than his father's coloring. He stood with the same unconscious pride, the same intelligent assessment of his surroundings. And Charlotte, despite her delicate features and auburn hair, had something indefinably familiar in the shape of her eyes, the tilt of her head when concentrating. Margaret watched William's face as understanding dawned like sunrise after the longest night. His expression moved through shock, calculation, certainty, and finally a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate him from within. He approached slowly, as if afraid that sudden movement might cause them to vanish like a mirage in summer heat. Margaret rose. Her name on his lips carried 4 years of searching, of wondering, of dreams interrupted by the harsh reality of her absence. She had forgotten how her name sounded in his voice, like a prayer, like a promise, like coming home. "William." Her voice came out barely above a whisper, all her carefully practiced composure abandoned in the face of this impossible reunion. Thomas, true to his nature, studied this new adult with the methodical interest he brought to all novel phenomena. "Mama, who is this gentleman?" William's eyes filled with something that might have been tears as he knelt to the boy's level, bringing himself into Charlotte's direct line of sight as well. "My name is William, and I am a friend of your mother's from a long time ago." Charlotte, always more intuitive than her brother, stepped closer to Margaret's skirts while continuing to study William with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "You look like Thomas," she observed with startling directness. "Charlotte," Margaret said quickly, but William held up a gentle hand. "She's quite right," he said softly, his gaze moving between the twins with wonder and recognition. "There is definitely a resemblance." The afternoon sun seemed to pause in its journey across the sky as the past and present collided in a small Vermont train station. Margaret felt the careful architecture of her new life trembling like a house built on sand, while simultaneously experiencing a joy so intense it threatened to overwhelm her hard-won equilibrium. "We should talk," William said quietly, his eyes holding hers with the same direct honesty that had first made her trust him. "There is much I need to tell you and much I hope you will help me understand." Margaret nodded, knowing that this moment had been inevitable since the day she left his estate. The reckoning she had postponed for 4 years had finally arrived, carried on the afternoon train like fate disguised as coincidence. The question now was whether the love that had once seemed strong enough to move mountains could survive the weight of truth, time, and the innocent eyes of 2 children who deserved nothing less than complete honesty from the adults who shaped their world. 2 weeks had passed since the afternoon that changed everything, and Woodstock Village had never seen such a transformation in its quiet rhythms. William Harrison Whitmore III had taken rooms at Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, conducting what he claimed was routine business for his Vermont lumber interests while engaging in the most important negotiation of his life, the patient reconstruction of trust with the woman who had given him the greatest gifts he had never known he possessed. Margaret's small cottage had become the center of careful courtship, where morning brought fresh flowers for the kitchen table and evening carried the soft murmur of adult conversation while Thomas and Charlotte played in the garden. William approached his children with the wonder of someone discovering treasure in familiar ground, learning their preferences and personalities with the dedication he had once applied to railroad timetables. Thomas had accepted his father's presence with characteristic deliberation, subjecting William to the same methodical study he gave to mechanical puzzles before pronouncing him acceptable for extended acquaintance. Charlotte, more immediately trusting, had begun saving her best drawings to show him and requesting his presence at her elaborate tea parties, where stuffed animals received lessons in proper deportment. But it was in the quiet hours after the children's bedtime that the real work of reconciliation took place. William and Margaret walked the village streets like tentative dancers, learning a new rhythm, their conversation weaving between past hurts and present possibilities, with the careful precision of people who had learned that love was fragile enough to be destroyed by careless handling. Victoria Pemberton married Harrison Blackwood of Boston 3 months after our engagement ended, William had explained on their third evening together, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. She was never pregnant, Margaret, never reconciled with me. The letter she showed you was a forgery, crafted by someone whose hatred ran deeper than any love she had ever known. Margaret had absorbed this information like rain on drought-parched ground, feeling 4 years of carefully constructed justification crumble into dust. The nobility of her sacrifice, the necessity of her exile, the protection of his reputation, all of it based on lies as elaborate as they were cruel. "I searched for you," William continued, his hand finding hers as they paused beside the village church where white steeples pierced the star-scattered darkness. "Every city, every convent, every refuge where a woman might seek sanctuary. I hired investigators, followed rumors, chased shadows for years before accepting that you had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed you. I didn't want to be found," Margaret admitted, her voice carrying the weight of truth finally spoken. "I believed her lies because they confirmed my worst fears about my place in your world. It seemed easier to disappear than to fight for something that felt too precious to be real." Now, as June painted the Vermont mountains in shades of emerald and gold, they faced the question that had hung unspoken between them since that first afternoon at the train station. William had business interests that required his presence across 3 states. Margaret had built a life that fit her like a comfortable dress, tailored to her needs and the rhythms of small-town respectability. The solution, when it came, emerged from the children themselves. "Papa William," Charlotte announced one morning as they shared breakfast in Margaret's small kitchen, "why don't you live here with us always? Then Mama wouldn't look sad when you have to leave for your business meetings." Thomas, ever practical, supported his sister's proposal with characteristic logic. "Our house is small, but we could make room. And Mrs. Hartwell says you're the politest gentleman she's ever had as a boarder, so you probably wouldn't be too much trouble." William's laughter filled the kitchen like sunlight, while Margaret felt her heart perform intricate acrobatics in her chest. This was the moment she had been simultaneously longing for and dreading, the invitation to trust happiness again, to believe that love might be strong enough to bridge any distance. "I have a proposal," William said, his eyes holding Margaret's with the direct honesty that had first made her trust him. "Not just for marriage, though I hope you will consent to that, but for a life that honors both who we were and who we have become." He had been corresponding with business associates throughout New England, he explained, exploring the possibility of establishing lumber and railroad interests centered in Vermont rather than New York. The mountains offered everything his industries needed, while the social pressures that had once seemed insurmountable would carry no weight in communities that valued character over pedigree. "Elizabeth is 16 now," he continued, preparing for her debut into society. "James is 13 and dreaming of Harvard. They could spend summers here, learning to know their siblings properly. Winters we could travel as a family, giving Thomas and Charlotte exposure to wider worlds, while maintaining our home here where love first learned to grow in honest soil." Margaret studied his face in the morning light, streaming through her kitchen windows, seeing not the railroad baron who had once commanded empires, but the man who had learned that true wealth could not be measured in stocks and bonds. He was offering her not just marriage but partnership in building something entirely new, a life that honored both their pasts while creating space for dreams they had never dared to imagine. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of complete trust, absolute faith, and the knowledge that some loves are strong enough to survive any test. The wedding took place on the 4th of July, in the Woodstock village church where white pews overflowed with neighbors who had watched Margaret build her quiet life of dignity and purpose. Elizabeth and James had traveled from New York for the ceremony, their initial awkwardness with their new siblings melting into genuine affection as they discovered the joy of being part of a family built on love rather than obligation. Thomas, resplendent in his first real suit, served as ring-bearer with the grave dignity he brought to all important ceremonies. Charlotte scattered rose petals with the artistic flair that marked everything she touched, her white dress floating around her like captured moonlight. But it was the sight of Margaret walking down the aisle, not in borrowed silk but in ivory wool she had sewn herself, carrying wildflowers picked from the very meadows where her children played, that brought tears to eyes that had witnessed the patient transformation of two souls who had found their way back to each other through years of separation and sorrow. Bishop Morrison, imported from Albany for the occasion, spoke of love that endures all things, believes all things, hopes all things. But the real blessing was visible in the faces of the bride and groom, two people who had learned that happiness is not a destination but a choice made daily, that love is not a feeling but a commitment to see each other truly. As summer settled over the Vermont mountains like a benediction, the Whitmore family, now complete in ways none of them had dared to imagine, began the work of building something that had never existed before, a life that honored both duty and desire, tradition and transformation, the claims of society and the deeper claims of the heart. In the garden behind their cottage, where Margaret taught Charlotte to tend roses and William showed Thomas the mysteries of mechanical engineering, love grew in honest soil watered by truth and tended by hands that had learned the patient work of forgiveness. And in the quiet evenings when the mountain shadows grew long and the children's laughter echoed across the valley, Margaret Rose O'Sullivan Whitmore knew that she had finally found her way home to a love strong enough to bridge any distance, endure any trial, and transform any ending into a beginning.